I haven't seen a software movement where a bunch of very smart people were excited about it that hasn't eventually worked. I think there's sort of broadly two methods that work in venture: heat seeking and truffle hunting. All these different strategies can work, but you got to know what it is and lean into it. The big five companies have 95% plus of the traffic and the money. And AI, as exciting as it is, will very likely accelerate that consolidation.
If you could make one change to the regulatory environment today, what would it be?
Look, I just think the main thing is...
Chris, I've been waiting many, many years for this one. I've heard so many great things from especially the team at Founder Collective, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Not at all, but I want to start with a little bit of context. And this is a weird show for many reasons, but I want to go back to when you were a child. If your parents were to describe you or your teachers were to describe you, how would they have described the very young Chris?
I think I'm kind of a little bit of a stereotype of tech people, which is I was into, it's sort of a cliche, but I was super into computers. And so that was a clear part of my personality, programming computers. And then, slightly entrepreneurial, like I had various jobs and tried to start businesses, failed businesses. I don't know. I guess I think curious, slightly mischievous, maybe, I don't know, or something like. But I don't think I don't know. I was, I think pretty normal in a lot of ways. I had a nice childhood. I grew up in kind of a smallish town in Ohio, and generally had a good experience. And so I don't think of anything out of extraordinary.
I heard from a little birdie that you studied philosophy at university and then have continued to study philosophy. Thanks, Alex Rampell. How did studying philosophy impact how you think, both just as a person and as an investor? So
I got into it from computers, a little bit like the current AI stuff. It was a long time ago, but in the sense of there's sort of overlap between, for those who read these kinds of books, there's like Daniel Dennett and Douglas Hofstadter, and there's sort of this overlap between, I guess, what these, or maybe they still call cognitive science and philosophy of mind and computer and AI and computer science. So that kind of got me into it. So it's on the more kind of analytic, they call it, scientific side of philosophy. And I just, like a lot of people at that age, had no idea what I wanted to do, and ultimately, I thought arrogantly that I knew how to program and didn't have any use for computer science. In retrospect, I think I could have taken some interesting theory classes and stuff. And then I stayed just kind of through inertia. I got invited to stay for a PhD program. But I was in New York, and in New York, you just sort of have to work, if you, unless you have the money. And so I was always doing freelance computer programming. And then that kind of in New York, in the around the late 90s, 2000, if you were doing computer programming, you ended up at an internet startup. And so I sort of discovered that world. And for me, that was basically, since then, have been, kind of fell in love with that. The idea that you could start a company or, someday invest in companies and work on interesting technology, work with interesting people, build products. I like the kind of real world aspect of it. Academia, you're very kind of cloistered.
When did you realize investing was your calling? Because you obviously were at Founder Collective for 3 years and worked with the team there. When was that, this is what I was born to do?
Well, I always thought it was, I'd read about it and thought it was interesting, but didn't have the means or, wasn't. Well, I worked briefly at Bessemer Venture Partners as a junior person in 2003 and for about a year. And then, but I didn't see a path, honestly. It was a much smaller industry. And I thought that I needed to be I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I needed to be an entrepreneur, I thought, to be a credible investor. So I left and started a company. They funded me along with General Catalyst. And then we ended up selling the company pretty early in 2006. And I literally, I think it was the day after we sold the company, I was on the phone with Ron Conway, and I was like, I want to start angel investing. And I think probably 4 days later, I was out in the Bay Area, and he was introducing me to people, I just wanted to do that. I was working at McAfee, but I also, it's more of a corporate job at that point. So I had time to do this stuff. So right away, and then you mentioned the Founder Collective guys, Dave Frankel and Eric Paley, we had known each other from school, and actually had a business plan. Funny enough, this would have been a great business, but we, 2004, we had been talking, like years before, had been talking about the fact that that we had all been entrepreneurs, Dave and Eric and I, and we had all gone out to raise money. And in the time, 2000, mid 2000s, if you tried to raise money, essentially the product that venture capitalists offer was a $10 million Series A was sort of the smallest check. They would occasionally do smaller checks, but they weren't really built for that. Like they want, like, especially on the East Coast, they wanted financial statements. They wanted, like, it just wasn't a seed funding environment. So we actually had a plan 2004 to start a consumer internet seed fund. And the idea was it's cheaper than, I mean, this is all obvious now, but I think at the time it was, somewhat forward thinking. The idea was to start is that companies needed less money and that the consumer internet was sort of, very much frowned upon by by a lot of, at least the East Coast, especially a little less on the West Coast. And there would be an opportunity there. And then I sold my company, Eric sold his company, Dave had been investing, like, personally. And, like, I think Eric had gotten some job offers or something. And we said, hey, why don't we dust off that business plan and do it? So that was Founder Collective. So we co-founded it back then. And so that was 2000. I think we started in 2008. I think we closed in early 2009. So we were raising during the financial crisis, which was, I think if you go back, we were one of very few funds then in the financial crisis. So that was that story. But yeah, I always thought it was interesting. Like, this world, there's all these interesting characters. And it's just like another way to be involved with startups. Like, I love startups. So I was like, okay, the sort of direct way to be involved with a startup is to start a company. And the next best thing is to be part of it as an investor.
So I have two questions on the back of this. One is, I have this theory that financially secure, or in other words, rich investors make better investors because they're not scared of downside and they don't bring paranoia and nerves to the entrepreneur like someone who really needs the money and needs it to work does. Do you agree that richer investors often make better investors?
I would put a spin on that. I would say that a lot of issues in, like, speaking of venture capital, a lot of issues are so-called principal agent problems, meaning the individual is not aligned with the kind of ultimately with the financial interests of the LPs, because, like, you're a junior person, you're afraid, and you have 3 shots on a lot of firms. You get 3 shots on goal or something like that, right? And you better have a hit. And if you don't, like, you're not promoted and you're fired, essentially. That creates a kind of like we're describing, and like, maybe this also applies to angel investing. But if you're in a business where 1 in 10, if not 1 in 100, 50 work really well. And by the way, in almost all cases that I've seen, the startups at work go through a trough of despair, right? Yeah. They go through a tough time. And so if you're in a business where it's like a very low hit rate, relatively speaking, the hits hopefully are so big they pay for everything, and you have these downturns, right? You just have to, like, the optimal strategy is to be really calm and not panicky. And there are lots of reasons people get panicky. One is maybe if, like, people should not invest more than some X% of their savings in this asset class. It's a very risky asset class, but it also occurs, I would say what you're saying is true. And it also occurs with professionals at firms. If they don't have, if they have incentives that aren't aligned fully with the fund.
Chris, I love doing the show because I just get to ask the smartest people in the world questions that I have naturally, and I just remove the schedule. You said there about the trough of sorrow. I'm totally with you, which leads to my no reserves model. I don't think that you can accurately pick your winners early. If you acknowledge the trough of sorrow, how do you think about effective reserves deployment?
It's funny you bring it up because, like, with Founder Collective, this was always a question in, like, early seed fund. Like, I guess I would. So you're talking about follow-on investing specifically. Like, how do you do follow-on investing? Yeah. I would say, honestly, I started off, like, back when we started Founder Collective, one of our tenets was to not do reserves and follow-ons. And the argument was that we would be fully aligned with the entrepreneurs, right? We weren't trying to, like we do the first investment and we want to see the next valuation be higher. And so we're fully aligned. And then the other argument was your argument, I think, essentially, that, like, it's, markets are efficient and, it will drag down our returns because we're going to be averaging up our cost basis, and, the real alpha comes from being early in seed investing. I kind of don't think, I just think that there's more being involved, with a company. There's just, just seeing like the ability to see an entrepreneur over a multi-year process and how they handle things. I don't know. I would say the data also that I've looked at, from my own history doesn't, because the winners can be just so, if you're good at it, the winners can just be so big that you want to do pro rata. So, it's a hard question. I do think I probably lean more toward the reserves and the pro rata kind of thing at this point.
Can I ask you on the flip side of that? You mentioned kind of going back to the early days of Founder Collective there and their preference for no reserves. Doug Leone said before on the show that we have moved from a high margin boutique business to a low margin commoditized industry. I'm just intrigued, given your perspective now over 14 years, having seen the Founder Collective start to the size of Andreessen today, which is immense and incredible. Do you agree with that transition?
Let me just maybe step back. So my theory, and then I'm not claiming this is original. You may have other people say this, but I think the first thing to think about with venture is barbelled, right? Which is, and this happens sort of death of the middle. Like this happens in a lot of industries. So the most famous would be retail, where, the internet comes along and you used to have JCPenney's and Sears and sort of these mid-size retailers that existed because you need logistics and shopping, and that's just the way people bought things, was they go to their nearby town and buy something. The internet comes along and you have this barbelling effect, right? So you have the very big winners like Amazon, who are very good at sort of hyper efficiency and logistics. And then on the other side, you have boutiques. And the financial winner there, for example, was LVMH, which is a roll up of boutique brands, right? And it's not a coincidence that the two most successful retailers of the last 20 years, one was on the one side of the barbell, Amazon, and the other was on the other side, LVMH. I think a similar thing has been happening in venture for the last 10 years as it matures. And so there's the A16Z kind of Sequoia strategy of being a big fund. And you have a different product you offer, quote unquote product you offer entrepreneurs, which is, operating services, help, full stage support. And then on the flip side, there's the kind of boutique model where it's early stage, probably sub $50 million funds, managers with some deep expertise in some area. And look, my experience is and I would say another dimension to this is strategy. If your strategy is to, I think there's sort of broadly two methods that work in venture. I would call one heat seeking and one truffle hunting. Right. So heat seeking is, it's the team out of Google that's doing foundation models, and it's just everybody in Silicon Valley thinks of it as the hot deal, and the game is to win it. Right. And that can work. If you get the Google, that or whatever, some massive success, heat seeking can work. But it's a different game than truffle hunting, which is, kind of the classic one I think of as like Union Square Ventures in 2005. Where they were the first ones to really see the Web 2 movement and develop that thesis. And, there's a bunch of cases in the history of venture where you sort of you have a thesis that someone else doesn't have. So I think I guess I think if you are cognizant of the barbell and you like a lot of the low margin things, I think are people that don't really understand their strategy. So they think they're a seed fund, but they've raised $500 million and they're actually competing with scaled funds that are better prepared to service the entrepreneur, or you don't really, I meet a lot of people who I think they're truffle hunters, but they're actually heat seekers, and you need to know what you're doing. And I think both can work. All these different strategies can work, but you got to know what it is and lean into it.
Chris, I love this so much for the different analogies already. Which would you say that Andreessen is, heat seeking or truffle hunting?
I think we try to do both, and that's the way I think about it. And I think about it explicitly, this is a heat seeking investment. This is a truffle hunting investment. For truffle hunting, by that I mean, it could, by the way, it could be you go deep, and often it's deep in a vertical before other people kind of figure it out. It can be within a vertical. Maybe it's, crypto when it's not cool. Maybe it's some sub segment of AI that's out of fashion or overlooked. Maybe it's a geography. So there's a lot of different ways to do these things. But I think you need to know what you're doing. And if you do each strategy, it's a very different thing. Like truffle hunting, you got to go deep. You got to be an expert. You got to meet everybody. You need to appeal to them. It's like when the entrepreneur meets with you, when you're in that, if you're Fred Wilson doing, consumer internet in 2005, you'll hear, you heard the reason that that Twitter picked him, when it was a competitive deal at the Series A, was that he was using the product, he was deep in the space. So it's a different strategy. Whereas heat seeking, it's much more of the sales motion. Like you're trying to win the deal that everyone wants to win. And so it becomes, about can you be the most helpful? It becomes like founder referencing. I think one of the things about this business that keeps people honest is that ultimately winning investments at large VC firms comes down to what the founders say about you. And that's a very good thing because it keeps the market, it forces people to behave, right? I mean, because you can't, there's no way to game that. Like what a founder will say, it's a special call, I think, at least my experience as a founder. If another founder calls you and they're about to choose a VC and devote the next 10 years of their life, people give pretty candid references, right?
Again, so many thoughts. Do you worry that we've over-rotated on founder NPS? We saw a lot of lack of governance in the last few years where there maybe should have been some.
I think, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. And my question to you is simply, I agree in terms of the importance of the founder reference, but it leads to, in some cases, just pure negligence because people don't want to have anything bad said about them.
I think there's a difference between being the founder's friend and being their partner. And so being their partner means you're, a good fiduciary, you're supportive, you help the company, you give them honest feedback. It's not always friendly feedback. That's an important, I think a bad partnership is you say yes to everything. And then the moment they need money, you say no, or you let them behave, not practice good governance. A good partnership is you're honest with them, you support them, but you're also there are times when the best thing for the company is, for example, for a CEO change or something. And that has to be a good partner would recommend that if that's actually the best thing for the company or a change in governance or whatever it might be. So I think that distinction is important. You're not look, I mean, obviously we become friends with people that we work with, but ultimately it's important to keep in mind that, the kind of professional roles that people have. And the fact, when you're involved with a startup, there's often many employees, many other investors. It's an important responsibility to be a good custodian of those people's careers. And so, you have to balance all these things, right?
I've spoken to many of the team at Founders Fund on the show, and they always say that the best founders don't need their VCs and they don't need help. How do you feel about the best founders actually don't need their VC? I
think there's a distinction between do you need advice and do you need sort of network, I guess. I just don't believe that especially if the sort of founders that we tilt towards, which are technical product founders, it's just impossible that they know the right customer prospect at all Fortune 500 companies. I just don't. So I think it depends. The best founders, do they know how to build the product and the technology? For sure. And for example, I'll speak for myself and not the firm, but I rarely, in fact, I rarely get involved in those parts of the companies. And in fact, I probably judiciously tried to not comment on that because I think sometimes board members and investors' opinions on this button should be purple or something, they'll say these things and then suddenly it'll become an organizational priority. So I think if you but there's just no reason that, for example, a founder doesn't have as much experience with fundraising. They don't know all the investors. They don't know all the potential partners. They don't know all the potential customers. They don't have the same talent network. It's just almost sort of, inconsistent with if they're truly a deep product or technologist sort of, founder, they just couldn't have been spending their time like that. And so I think it's about what you add, as opposed to. So I think if they're saying that, if the Founders Fund folks are saying that in terms of product and technology, I tend to agree. Something is wrong if Chris Dixon is giving you your tech ideas or product ideas. But if I'm introducing you to a great executive, I think that's working well.
Chris, why do you think the best founders in the world pick you? I have many thoughts. Good choice, my friend. I have many thoughts from Ron Conway and Alex. But why would you say the best founders choose you? Again,
this is a business I think that primarily goes down to founder referencing, and so I'm not on those calls. But I think ultimately, when you're competing over an investment that is the determining factor. And so, what those folks say about you is very important. I would also say specific to blockchain crypto, there's a lot of sensitivity around the fact that we've now been through maybe 4 cycles if this is a bull market. And every time that there's a downturn, kind of a lot of investors leave. And that becomes I've had a lot of that becomes a big issue. And it's very important to founders that you are high conviction. And that comes out again in founder referencing. By the way, that's not just my group at the firm. That's throughout the firm. I think there's a kind of a misunderstanding around this, that I see some articles that misunderstand it. We don't pivot at A16Z. Like, we've never pivoted. We have we've done AI since I've been at the firm, since 2013. We've done blockchain, crypto consistently. We've done bio, we've done SaaS, we've done video games. Over time, we've created verticals. Like, as we think something's working, we've spun out verticals like crypto, games, bio. But we've stayed very high conviction in those areas. Sometimes we're too early, and that can mean there's a challenging, era, but that's kind of just how we practice it. And I think that's important to founders. Like, when they're, they want to know that their investors, this is, you mentioned Ron Conway, who's a good friend. He always says, I don't know if it came from him, but I've heard him say it is, you make your money in the bull market and your reputation in the bear market.
Ron actually told me that you are a master of conviction and, quote, you have remained undeterred in the face of the most adverse conditions. I mean, it's a very nice thing to hear. My question to you is,
high conviction, yeah.
When the world and the market tells you you are wrong, how do you retain that undeterred conviction?
I think there's different ways to do this job, and different ways can work. And I think a lot of people in the industry today, they'll say things like, I don't try to predict the future, I just try to predict the present. Like, or I look, there's a lot of focus these days on metrics, on, as you know, ARR and all these other kinds of things. And there's a lot of kind of moving around to different areas. And that can work, and it has worked for people. I have a different view, which is I do try to predict the future. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I think, as I recall, Peter Thiel, I think in 0 to 1, he has this part about it, about sort of a deterministic or indeterministic future. Like, I fall into the deterministic camp. Like, I think that, people should, I'm not saying everyone should do this. The way I approach it is I have a view of the future, and I want to get to that future. And I spend a lot of time, like, if, in my book and other places, you'll see this, reading about the history of technology, trying to understand it. A lot of that is to try to understand how the future might play out, is to look and study the patterns, and to study the kind of the underlying forces. I think that's, when you have an incredibly complex system with economics and technology and people and all of these things, it's very hard to kind of draw lines through charts. I don't think that's a very good way to view in the future. I think a better way is to really understand the dynamics and the historical forces and things like that. So that's my approach. And I've just spent so much time on it that I believe in it. And that's why, I think we'll talk about my book. Like, if you read that book, that is a book of somebody who is, I believe, you can agree or disagree with it. It's somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about the internet, and it has a lot of frameworks for how these things play out. And I believe in those frameworks. And I think, there are setbacks, like in crypto, the stuff that happened 2 years ago with FTX and a bunch of scandals, I think set back the space maybe a couple of years. That this is the kind of thing that your frameworks can't help you with, right? There's just things in the world that happen, these exogenous events. There's ways you can mitigate that kind of risk through, for example, companies having more having longer runways and things. But anyway, that's just my approach, and I believe in it. And actually, the book, which I wrote, a part of the book was writing the book was a test of conviction. I think if you can write something out in 230 pages in detail, an argument, like, that helps you kind of vet that argument and test and kind of pressure test it.
We're going to get to the book. I just want to ask on this. Alex Rampell told me that you are the master of strong opinions loosely held. And so on this, there's a point when you do let them go. Can you talk to me about when you have enough data to realize that you need to change your mind?
I mean, I change my mind about little things all the time. I mean, I think of venture as, sort of this fox and hedgehog. The fox knows many things, the hedgehog one thing. Like, venture is the fox business, I think. Like, it's like you're constantly tuning your neural network. What are all the different things that go into decision making? And it's very complex, and there's many things. And that's one reason it's sort of it takes a long time, I think, to really get good at it. And it's very important to have mentorship and other things, because it's very hard to kind of get these neural networks trained. So I just want to make clear, I'm constantly, like, there's lots of little things that I think and specific, this sector is not going to work. This one is, that kind of thing. But on the big thing, look, I guess if anything, I've been emboldened on the big thing. Every single thing. Marc Andreessen and I talk about this a lot. Like I think his phrase is, "There's no bad ideas. There's only too early." Like I've literally spent, my entire internet. First of all, I've spent my entire internet career. I started my internet career when the internet was kind of a joke. People today cannot picture this. It was. And so you start your business, you start your career in a highly contrarian area, that shapes you. I then doubled down in the financial crisis and then did a whole bunch of, things like blockchain and VR and other things over 10 years ago. So I've just been used to this and I've just kind of block out the noise and I just look at I just kind of try to look at the fundamentals. I'm very careful about the information I consume and really focusing on primary sources. I think that for example, on the crypto blockchain stuff, like most mainstream news coverage is just factually incorrect. And I could go through with a red pen and show you all the mistakes. And that, if you just read that, and I assume that's probably the case for other areas, it's the Murray-Gell-Mann thing, it's not just the area I know, it's others. And so like I talk to entrepreneurs all day. I look at metrics. I read technical and product papers, and read a lot of books and history. And when you do that, I don't know, like it's a different set of inputs. I haven't seen a technology movement, a software movement, where a bunch of very smart people were excited about it in my career that hasn't eventually worked. I started an AI company in 2008, and I sold it to eBay in 2011, a machine learning company called Hunch. I was obviously too early, but eventually it worked. I think the interesting question to me is not whether something like crypto blockchain will work. I don't think it's a question. I think it's a question of the timing is a question. As it was with AI and other things, but you can do a lot of work to try to understand the timing too. So.
Speaking of the timing and moving more to crypto specifically, you said to me before that big tech is stifling the internet, but blockchain networks can break the stranglehold. Again, moving to very much today into the crypto space, why is big tech first strangling the internet? Just so we have an element of causation.
Yeah. So, and this is, in my book, in Read, Write, Own, I go through in the first couple of chapters to try to sort of, I sort of think of the book as split between, on the first half, diagnosing what happened. So how did the internet go from an open and democratically controlled system in the 90s to, a internet that's essentially controlled by 5 companies today? The big 5 companies have 5% plus of the traffic and the money. And I think that's AI, is exciting as it is, will very likely accelerate that consolidation because it rewards companies with large stores of data and capital. And so, why did that happen? I go through in detail, and I think it has to do, my argument is, we started off with the internet is a network of networks. So like there's the base layer, the internet protocol that connects hardware, and then we build networks on top. And in the 90s, the dominant networks were email and the web, which are what I call protocol networks. People call them protocols. They are networks that are more like, they're standards among a community, and the network effects, which don't accrue to a company, they accrue to the community. And then in the 2000s, there were a lot of great things that happened, including kind of the democratization of the internet that went from a couple 100 million to 5 billion people. People got lots of great services. But in the flip side, in that process, we adopted internet services that had a different architecture, that were controlled by companies and not by communities. And that sort of seemed fine in the 2000s and even the early 2010s, when those companies acted in very open ways and supported, allowed for creators and software developers and entrepreneurs to build businesses on top of them. But they've since changed the way they're doing that. And that's why, look at consumer internet investing today. There's very few successful consumer internet companies the last 10 years. That's because you have this sort of chokehold with these 5 companies. And so my argument then is that what blockchains let you do is create a new wave of internet services, which have the societal benefits of those early protocol networks, but a lot of sort of what I say is called the competitive advantages, sort of the advanced functionality, the ability to do a lot of financial things that make them competitive with these corporate networks. So that's and I think that's important because
what does that look like in reality, Chris? Sorry, just to take it down to a more human level. What does that actually look like in reality for these networks?
So, for example, I'll just give you an example. We have it's a blockchain-based social network called Farcaster. We're investors in, and Farcaster, if you use it, you can download it and use it. It's got a couple 100,000 active users today. It will feel a lot like a Twitter or something. It's the user experience, everything else. The difference is that on Twitter, when I have C. Dixon and I have an audience, that's controlled by Twitter, and they can change the algorithm, they can change the economics, they can change the rules, they could remove me from the platform. On Farcaster, I control my name and I control my audience, much more the way like with an email list. Like you think about you have your email list on Substack, you own that list. If Substack messes with you, you can switch to another provider. That's how Farcaster works. So Farcaster's the protocol, and there's many different clients. The same way with email and with web browsing, you have many different clients. And so it provides the kind of advanced functionality of social network that you want and all the features, but it pushes control to the users. And so they have choice. They can choose different software providers, right? That's just one example. But we have dozens in our portfolio of new services where the functionality is very advanced and modern, but it has different economic and control properties because it using blockchain shifts power to the edges of the network, the users, the creators, and the software developers.
Chris, you're a student of history, and you mentioned the power of incumbents there. I've never been more worried about the size of incumbents. As we mentioned, the size of their data is enormous. The free cash flows of their businesses is enormous. Have incumbents ever been this dangerously large? And is it not too big to usurp them with a Farcaster or a Hive Mapper, or you name any of your innovations, given the free cash flow machines that these businesses have?
So I have a chapter for those interested in the book it's called Community Created Software, where I kind of walk through this. But if you look at the history of the technology industry, it's basically moved to different layers the competition has moved to different layers of the stack. So prior to Microsoft, the business of computing was to sell hardware. Companies like IBM would sell mainframe computers. They'd bundle it with software and services, but the business was hardware. The contrarian innovative idea of Bill Gates was that software would be the next layer of value, right? And that was the idea behind Microsoft, and it turned out to be correct. And so they had very high cash flows, very high margins. And essentially began to commoditize the hardware layer. You didn't care if you got Compaq or Dell as long as you had Windows and Office, right? And then what happened was open source software came along, and particularly like Linux, which is fast forward today by far the dominant operating system in the world. And it turned out that sort of a ragtag group of people could create a better operating system than this giant high cash flow company. Right, and that I think is I think the rise of open source software I think is a very underappreciated thing. It's the fact that every Android phone is running open source software. A lot of your Apple computer is running it, and certainly every back-end system runs all open source stacks. All the new devices do, and this was a movement that was a crazy left-wing political movement in the 80s, and then dismissed in the 90s. Go read. 98 was the DOJ case against Microsoft. Go read the documents. Like Linux doesn't occur. It's all about Sun and Java. So and yet that was when Linux was growing. And so I think that there's a famous essay from the 90s, Eric Raymond, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And he talks about these sort of different ways to make software. Like one is the cathedral is Microsoft. It's this, cathedral, the product managers are the priests. They speak in secret incantations. And then the bazaar is this, it's just like this cacophonous marketplace of brilliant people and crazy people and all the sort of things you get with the internet and humanity. But in the end, his prediction, and he was right, is that the bazaar would win because you would have just as Bill Joy famously said, the co-founder of Sun, no matter how many smart people you have working for you, that most of the smart people don't work for you, I'm butchering it, but most of the smart people work for somebody else, right? And it's just, if you just look at how many people at these big cash flow companies actually work on cutting edge new products. Right? I mean, Google has 300,000 employees or something. The vast majority are doing customer service, product management. They're maintaining old products. They're doing bureaucratic, PowerPoints, arguing over politics. I don't know what they do, but like, I bet you there's 1,000 people that are really doing cutting edge new products for as big as these companies are. And, there's that many people working on Ethereum that are very, very smart, and they have people from all over the world. And so I think this force of so blockchains are to centralized services as open source software was to centralized operating systems, right? Like that's what we're doing here. We're trying to open the services layer of the internet. And I think that this historically, this pendulum has swung back and forth between the cathedral and the bazaar. And I think there's a lot of pent up energy to support the bazaar. And I think that as powerful as these companies are, that they have, look, and I can't predict the future. You may be right. Maybe it's too late. Maybe it's over. But I think there's a lot of strong forces that will ultimately support a more kind of community built internet services layer than we have today.
Can I ask, what do you think is the biggest challenge to the next generation community built services layer that we both want to see? Is it the talent acquisition from the community platforms? Is it the cash flow machines? Is it the distribution of the cash flow machines? What are the biggest barriers that the community led next generation has to break to enable or to be what it could be? I think
there's two things. I think so I would describe it. So in the book, I talk about what I call the computer and the casino. And so this idea is that around blockchains, there are two communities that have developed. The casino is a set of folks who are more interested in kind of the trading and gambling aspects of meme coins. And, and like, I think, to me, this is where FTX and Luna and a bunch of these catastrophes kind of came out of that community. And the computer is people who, like me, view blockchains as a computing movement. I was just at ETH Denver. Ethereum has these series of community organized conferences. You go there and it's awesome. It's like early Linux days or it's like, thousands of nerds talking about computing and stuff. Like, I love it. And that world is kind of ignored, I think most people that think about the blockchain world don't realize that exists, how big it is and how lively it is. That's the world I'm part of. That's what we invest in. I think so I think of it as there's the blockchain as a computer movement. And then we're on the one side, we have people that are, I think, co-opting that movement for this kind of casino activities. And on the other side, we have, basically the sort of the mainstream world, the policymakers, the media, the establishment, all of these forces that are against us. The establishment, banking, the big banks hate crypto. The big tech companies hate crypto. Media seems to hate crypto. Certain elements of the government seem to hate crypto. So we've got that on one side, and then we've got these kind of co-opters on the other side. So that, and I think what's going on is that the reason those people don't like it is they see the casino side, and they don't understand that there's two sides to it. And that in an ideal world, what we would do is come up with policy prescriptions. And this is what we've been calling for years, long before FTX. We've had stuff on our website. We've been advocating for it, is policy that encourages the innovative use cases and discourages the harmful use cases, right? In an ideal world, that's what you'd have, is you'd have something that sort of reins in the speculation, the casino stuff, but allows somebody when they're building like a new social network using blockchains to have a path to be compliant. Instead, what we have today is actually the opposite, which is we actually have a regulatory system which, so just to give you an example, creating a meme coin, meme coin is just an utterly stupid token. It has no purpose by design. You can create a meme coin, you can own 10% of it, you can dump it and get rich. And as long as you don't manipulate the markets and things like this, basically that's legal. If you then take that meme coin and try to build something useful, like a game or a financial service, that's when you get tripped up with regulators today. So we have a system now that literally encourages the casino behavior and discourages the productive use cases. So you asked me what the biggest challenge is. That's the biggest challenge, is that we have this, I think, this harmful community on one side, and then we have are trying, and this is why I wrote a book. This is why I speak to a lot of people about this, that we it's not a sensible, it'd be as if we had an AI policy that allowed you to create, dangerous bioweapons, but didn't let you create customer service chatbots. Like, it's just opposite land of what we should be doing.
So, Chris, as I said, everything is editable. And I asked from pure inquisition because I am naive as fuck on this, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Why does everyone throw the accusation then against Andreessen Crypto for pump and dump?
That's just factually incorrect. So I don't know where they get their alleged facts. So first of all of our funds are 10-year venture funds. We throughout the lifetime of the crypto funds, we today hold 94% of our investments. The length of the lockup in some ways is limited by the market. So we've been advocates. In other words, if we go too far, the entrepreneurs won't work with us. And so we've been advocating for a long time for regulatory guardrails that make longer lockups. I don't understand where this comes from. Look, you don't have to believe that we're good people or something, but just look at all the charts, look at the history of venture capital. Like, selling your winners is the worst possible strategy, and the things that aren't winners don't move the needle on funds. Like, it's just not how venture capital works. There's a J curve, and that holding things for a long time is always, if it's a growing market that's growing in value, which crypto has, is always a good strategy. So I don't know. That's just misinformation.
Can I ask you, you mentioned there the kind of casino-like culture, and you mentioned the word speculation. Is speculation bad always? Like, can it not be an inroad for interest? No,
I don't. Look, I don't think speculation is always bad. I think that I would liken it to the housing market. So to me, the point of a blockchain is to enable digital ownership. And so, like, an NFT is a digital object, and it can represent a name on a social network. It can represent an object in a video game. It can represent a piece of art. It can represent whatever the creator wants to represent. Similar to the offline world, like, I think we'd all agree that home ownership has a positive societal value, right? Like, it's psychologically, personally rewarding to own a home and have a family, and I think we think societally, like, people that own homes are more likely to improve their homes, are more likely to contribute to their community. So home ownership's a good thing. We also have speculation around real estate. People flip houses, REITs and all this other kind of stuff. I don't think the speculation is bad, but I think that the point is home ownership. And in fact, the speculation pays a purpose, right? You have price discovery, liquidity. And I think generally society, we allow speculation. I mean, stock markets are similar, right? Like, the purpose of a stock market is to productively allocate capital to companies that are building products. The byproduct is you have hedge funds and other folks like that. They do provide liquidity and they play a service, right? I think the problem, my issue with the casino community around blockchains is the focus. The focus should be on building useful services that enable digital ownership. As a byproduct, there should be markets around that, and those markets should be regulated, and it should be tamped down. The issue is, you ask most people, you read the media, et cetera, like, all of the focus is on the casino, and that skews incorrectly the perception of the technology. If
you could make one change to the regulatory environment today, what would it be?
I mean, we have a bunch of specific, proposals. I think I just think the main thing is that as an entrepreneur, and this ends up affecting our business because, like, as an entrepreneur, you don't want gray area. If you're a top computer scientist and you're choosing what sector to go into, and one sector there's gray area, so there's some % chance that no matter what you do, you get a subpoena or something. A lot of people just won't do that. And on the flip side, with the gray area, if you're a bad actor and your other career choices are stealing money or something, like creating a meme coin seems like a good idea, right? And so what happens with these gray areas is that it just took me a while to appreciate. I had to work in the space. Like, I didn't understand how kind of policy worked and how policy interacted with entrepreneurship. But I will say that my chief learning there is that gray areas discourage good entrepreneurs and encourage bad actors. And so my main thing is, we talk about this a lot, like clarity. Now, obviously, we want not just clarity, bright line rules. Here's what you do. Here's what you don't do. And of course, a pathway. It could be it could be a onerous pathway, but a pathway to building these products. And so there's very specific proposals that that out there that we've been advocates of that that do that and tamp down the speculation and allow for entrepreneurs to build products and have long lockups and disclosures and security audits and like all these things that should be happening that in a sensible policy environment would be happening, just aren't happening today. Like you have these hacks and it's because there's no requirements around security audits. Like there should be requirements around that. Like we can't, we can try to force it, but if we go too far with entrepreneurs, they won't work with. Like we're not the referee, right? And you need a referee for some of these things.
Can I ask a blunt one? How would a Trump administration impact the regulatory environment for crypto?
I mean, it's complicated. There's, there are obviously 3 branches of government, all matter. In fact, a lot of it's playing out in courts right now. And the judiciary matters a lot. I think ultimately this will get resolved, I hope, through congressional legislation. So that matters a lot. The executive branch matters too, and who they pick. Look, a lot of it just comes down to who they pick as the head of agencies. And you could imagine, I think that generally Trump, I don't know, but like Republicans tend to skew more, kind of pro-business. And so there's some, but ultimately it really comes down to the specific people they choose to run these agencies.
Chris, why did you decide to write the book now?
Well, one is I needed time to write it. And after the sort of last downturn, I had more time. So I thought it was a good opportunity. But really it was that I feel like the technology is very misunderstood. And I wanted to have a single, like a one-stop shop for somebody who wanted to understand it to be able to, and to hear the other side of the story, because I think they hear the negative side a lot. And I wanted to provide the other side of the story and the full kind of treatment of it.
I often think, like, who's the customer for the book? Is this a net new entrant to crypto? Is this an existing crypto enthusiast? For you writing it, who was that customer in your mind?
I think of it as concentric circles. There's the crypto community, which I think, and I think has embraced it, honestly, in a very nice way as sort of the book, the best explainer. And then there's the next ring of the circle is all the people they know. So you're joining Coinbase and your family is like, isn't that the thing with Dogecoin? And you're like, no, family member, it's actually more than that. Here's a book to read it, right? And I'm very excited to say that I've heard a lot of feedback that's happening now. So it's becoming that book that people kind of give to let's call it crypto adjacent people, right? Which there's a lot of. There's hundreds of thousands of those people, right? There's 50,000 that work in the industry. I don't know what the exact number is, depending on how you count it, because there's a lot of non-official organizations and things. But and then if they all give it to 5 friends, kind of thing. And then look, I also think there's people that are tech interested, but not deep in these spaces, who just want to understand something, who are open-minded. I'm sure there's a set of people who this is a controversial topic. There's a set of people that won't read it, or will that just can't possibly be open-minded about it. But I think there's a pretty big set of people that are open-minded who read books. One thing about books, this is one thing I debated, is when you actually look at the book sales figures of all books, it's sort of surprising how small, like when you're used to the internet, it's just small number. Like there's kind of, I don't know, 1 million people that still read nonfiction books in the country or something. I mean, the best-selling nonfiction book last year was 400,000 books or something, and that was like a self-help book. So it's just a smaller set of people. So when you write a book, you're kind of saying, it's a smaller set of people, but I'm hoping, they're an important set of people that read books. I also, to the audience, I also think about this, which is like, I had books that really influenced my life. And I imagine it would be cool if 10 years from now, I meet somebody who's an entrepreneur who's done some really interesting stuff, and the book was part of that. So even though books, did you see, the phrase canon event? Did you see Spider-Verse 2? It's become a meme. So I think of it as like books, like a blog post can reach, millions of people. A tweet can reach millions of people. Books reach a smaller group, but they can be canon events. They can really affect people's lives. And so that's how I think of it, both as like a way to explain it to the people that are adjacent, but also potentially a way to kind of influence entrepreneurs. And particularly like when they talk about the computer and the casino, I'm trying to influence those entrepreneurs to go towards the computer and like explain the whole thing to them and explain why this is the right path to take. So I'm hoping to kind of nudge the industry in that direction.
Chris, do you think brand is more important than ever in venture?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't think about, to be honest, I don't think about venture as a category. I mean, I'm thinking about my day job. I think that the internet changed the way that information flowed for sure. And I think probably unbundled a lot of brand and venture. So it used to be like when I started off, there were just these kind of like, it was just these black boxes. It was like Sequoia and Kleiner and I don't know, Benchmark and Excel, and you'd hear rumors about who the people are. You'd hear literally like rumors about how term sheets work because there was no blogging about it. There weren't really books on it. And so it's just sort of like this mysterious, like thing that you didn't really understand, but the firms carried a lot of weight, right? Like the firm name was the thing, like it was a big deal, and you saw it, you read about the history and the companies they'd funded, and I think that's how fundraising worked too, right? With LPs, they were like, this is why. I mean, this is a lot of what's happened with the unbundling I was talking about before, where you have the barbell and the rise of seed funds, right? Is if you're someone like you. Like the calculus has changed versus 20 years ago, where then you had to join a big firm to raise money, and now you don't because you have your own brand, right? And so I think the sort of unbundling of the branding, where you can just build your brand with your podcast and with the other things you do, and then of course over time with your investing and everything, is very different.
The thing that I worry about, honestly, Chris, is the weight of capital is different. $5 million to me is very different to $5 million to you and Andreessen. And so you can do a 5 on 25 with ease. Whereas for me, that's a big bet in a early company with absolutely no traction and very little to go on. When the weight of capital is different, it makes it very hard for boutiques to survive, I think.
Yeah, I think that, I guess the counter argument, I hear that.
If you think to Founder Collective, they can't throw.
I will say I'll speak for my own for my own vertical here, my own area, which is we do very little seed investing, and the reason is we take conflicts very seriously, meaning we invest in one company per category, and if we go too early, like that's sort of our bet in the category, and so. I do so we do most of our stuff is like a true Series A and not seed. That I do for that reason, and I think that, and I try to work very hard to collaborate with seed funds and sort of they go earlier, and then so that's just speaking for myself. That's obviously not true throughout the industry. I think though that if you really sharpen your value proposition, like why do people want you? Like if you have a sharp value proposition as an early stage seed invest fund and you size your fund accordingly, I think. I feel like, you mentioned Ron Conway, like he's able to, operate his business through lots of different environments, including the current one, successfully. And there are others who do, but I think the days of just being kind of like a helpful person probably over. Like you need a sharper way to kind of help the founders.
Do you agree with if the cash is on the table, you should take it? Because if you have a 2 on 10 versus a 5 on 25, it's a lot more money. It's a much better price. It's hard to argue and tell a founder that no, the 2 on 10 is better.
I think there's honestly, I think, and maybe this sounds like I'm talking my book, but I would say this even if I were a founder. Like I think there's many factors. Like, this is a 10 plus year relationship with your investors. It's a long-term thing. Look, obviously the dilution and everything matters, and so you shouldn't be crazy. But I think it's an important factor. But I also think that the way I think about it is you're building a company. You're thinking about how do I kind of assemble an excellent team of excellence, both in my company and around my company. And some of those decisions are like who you take as investors, basically irreversible. So I do think you should know who you're dealing with.
Final one before we do a quick fire, which is as part of that partnership, often it comes with a board seat. What are your biggest lessons on what it takes to be a great board member, and how has your style of board membership changed over time as an investor? Yeah,
I think a lot of it is just being a good, is good governance, and it's unfortunately I think it's relatively easy to be in the top quartile of that if you care about it, if you're supportive in both up cycles and down cycles. Like to your point earlier, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on when the market drops. And I'm not just talking about crypto here. I'm talking about regular venture, when the downturn happens, because you just have individuals. You have somebody who's early in their career at venture. They made 3 investments. They've told their partners this is their hot company, and now it's struggling. They're worried. This happens a lot. Or maybe the fund isn't doing well and they need to recover money. Maybe they have I just had a situation where, the investors came in at a high valuation and they have a high preference stack. And so like they would financially be better off if the company sold themselves right now versus the early stage investors because of the way preferences work. You have different incentives. You have people who micromanage and try to, board members who don't really have the expertise trying to give granular product advice. So I think I don't mean to sound negative, but I do think a lot of it is just not being bad. It's like helps a lot. Caring, being there for downturns, being like a true kind of, it's complicated when you're an investor, right? Because you're kind of wearing two hats. You're wearing the board member hat and you're wearing the investor hat. And so being able to sort of separate those, I think that's a lot of it. If you bring some detailed, some expertise, like operating expertise or financial expertise, that's a bonus. But I think just that alone is just an important thing when I describe.
Final one before the quick fire. Do you enjoy the size and scale of Andreessen today? Like, it's very different to the firm that you joined 11 years ago. Do you prefer it today than you did when it was much smaller and more boutiquey and I'm sure less process driven? And
I will say, first of all, we're very verticalized now. So we're a big firm, but I run a vertical and it's pretty independent. And that's important because I think we actually avoid a lot of the bureaucracy and other things. We had a period where that was a transition period where we weren't like that always, but I think we're in a very good spot there. I think this is just a personal thing for me. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but at some point I think my interest kind of shifted from just investing in startups to sort of having impact. I remember when I joined the firm in the beginning or I was considering joining in 2012, I joined in the beginning of 2013, thinking a lot about the fact that it was starting to really bug me that, I'd put some money into an investment and they would either do well or not. And I would think to myself, did I actually have any impact? Or if I didn't do it, would somebody else have just put that money in? It was an oversubscribed round, like someone else would have invested. Yeah, maybe I gave some advice and this and that. And so is this what I want to do? And so what really appealed to me, why I joined, is when I talked to Marc and Ben, I was like, look, we just went through the era of mobile social cloud. These are the three big computing trends. I think there will be, in the next 10 years, we'll have another wave of multiple computing trends. And I want to aggressively invest in those areas. And I think there were a handful of organizations in the world who at that time would have supported a plan like that. And Andreessen, Horowitz, Marc and Ben were one of them, right? And that's what we've been doing. I mean, so that just to go back, that was my motivation, and that's still very much my motivation today. And I think about it in terms of impact. Obviously, we manage the fund, and there's all the kind of financial aspects of it. But for me, that's a lot of my motivation, is not just kind of riding along, but actually having some influence.
I guess my question is, how do you assess your own relationship to money, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, I think that, I think the healthiest relationship, if you're in the tech industry and lucky enough to be successful, is to think of money mostly as capital, as mostly as a way to invest in people and ideas that you believe in. And so, Marc, Andreesen, and I have been for a long time, both first individually and for the last 7 years together, investing in funds, supporting new managers, starting venture funds. We do other kind of things, like I don't know if you've seen this, California Forever. This was something we did. It's a new city in Northern California that, at the time didn't fit into the venture fund model. So we did that, as a personal thing we did. Later on, that changed and the firm did invest. But I support, I'm very interested in sort of internet freedom, blockchains, open source software, being able to support some of those causes. So I think that's the healthiest relationship with money. I've seen a lot of, as you do this kind of job over time, you see a lot of unhealthy relationships with money. And you see people that kind of, make money and end their career or get on the, kind of hedonistic treadmill or something. And I don't know. So there's lots of unhealthy relationships. I'll say that. I think that's a healthy way to think about it. It's just a resource to kind of do things that help people you like or causes you like.
Chris, we're going to do a quick fire round because otherwise I could talk to you all day. One, what have you changed your mind on in the last 12 months?
Probably a lot of things. I think one that might be interesting is COVID, like a lot of like everyone, I guess we went remote, and I really wanted to believe this was the new world. And all these kinds of, tweet threads that you read about how the world's changed. And I wanted to believe that, just that you could have now a globally distributed workforce, people could live wherever they want. I've come to think it's, especially in our business, just doesn't work. And that, we've now kind of returning our, like at least on our investment team, back in one place in New York. It's just, the relationships are very hard. It's very, in some ways, I think what works in remote teams is that you're kind of piggybacking off past relationships, and it's very hard to build new relationships. It's hard to sort of share knowledge. This is a quick fire round. I'll stop. But that's been something I think I've changed my mind.
What are you most concerned about in the world today, Chris?
Well, the issue I spend the most time on that I'm concerned about are these issues we're discussing. I think sort of I would call broadly internet freedom, little tech versus big tech. I think that the outside world would say that someone like me and you work in the tech industry. I see myself as working on the behalf of sort of little tech, of startups. I think that having a dynamic internet economy and software economy is good for the world. I think it's good for innovation. I think it's good for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think we're at serious risk of losing that. And I think to me, the two issues are, I think that there's a real effort to ban open source AI, and there's a real effort to ban blockchains. And I care a lot about those two issues and spend a lot of time thinking about that and working on that.
Should we open source?
Yeah, by the way, there's many other obviously issues in the world that are important. But these are the ones that I personally feel like I can contribute to.
I've got to ask, should OpenAI be open sourced?
I think everyone should choose their own strategy. That's fine. I just think that open source should be frontier open source model should be legal. And if you look at the Biden executive order, it looks like you're going to have to register, and there'll be export controls. So I just think every project should have a choice, and they can do whatever they want. But Mistral and I don't know, all the other, like Llama with Facebook, they should all be allowed to open their code, open their weights. I think there's just a lot of crazy panic right now about this, and all it's going to do is further entrench the obvious thing that's going to happen if they do put regulations around this is just further entrench the power of the big five companies.
What's the biggest lesson from working with Marc and Ben for over a decade?
Yeah, I mean, so we used to for the first 5 or so years I was at the firm, we'd sit in this in the room, and there were a relatively small number of us at the firm, and just sit around and talk about mostly investing. I mean, like entrepreneurs would come in and then we talk about it. So it'd be hard to enumerate all of the things I've learned, and hopefully I've taught them some things, but mostly I've probably learned from them. I mean, we have a couple frameworks I like. There's Ben, this is when you join the firm, it's in our onboarding, is first class business in a first class way. And it's just sort of everything we do, no matter how seemingly small it is, needs to be conducted in sort of a high integrity way. And I think if you talk to people who interact with our firm, regardless of who at the firm, you often will hear that. Like, it's just everything is done in a very sort of high integrity way in which we really care about it. And we care very much about who we hire and the culture we create. I think we like to say invest in strength, not lack of weakness. That applies both to portfolio, like company investing, but also hiring. So we try to find people that have some very special ability. Often that comes bundled with issues, but like the issues are things that we can try to work through, as opposed to looking for people that are kind of perfect and well-rounded but maybe not exceptional. We're in the exception business. Venture capital is the exception business. It's the exception business with investing. It's the exception business with hiring. Like, you can't lose sight of that, and you have to always remind yourself of it.
Chris, what's your biggest miss, and how did that impact your mindset?
I've had a lot. I mean, everyone. I think it's an important moment in your investing career to have high conviction pass and then have it become a big thing. And everyone I know has had that happen. And then you're like, oh, wow, I've got to go readjust my mental model. I mean, I had a lot. I started investing in, I guess it was 2006, 2007 when I sold my first company. And I remember one thing that was funny was my company was a security company. I sold to McAfee. And so one might think that I'm knowledgeable about internet security. And I remember 4 years into it, noticing that my best investments were non-security and my worst investments were security. And I sort of thought about why that is. And I came to the conclusion it's because in the security ones, I was over weighting the idea, because I had a whole bunch of ideas. I thought things should be built, and someone came in that had one that matched one of those ideas. And I was like, okay, here's some money. Whereas in the non-security areas, I was much more agnostic about the ideas and just sort of met the people and was like, wow, that person's really smart. Right. And so my conclusion was, I needed to significantly increase the kind of weighting I put on the people. And I actually eventually developed kind of a methodology that I think about now, which is there's a very interesting balancing act you do in venture, which is you do need to become an expert on something. Like obviously I spent a lot of time on crypto and blockchains and I know a lot about it, but you also have to be willing to throw out your expertise and just say like, wow, that person knows more than me. That person's smarter than me. And so there's this kind of balancing act between prepared mind and humility that took me a long time to kind of get right, I think. And so, yeah, that was through a series of misses, a whole bunch of stuff early on.
Final one for you, Chris. Where do you want to be in 10 years? What does Chris Dixon in 2034 look like?
I mean, I'm very focused on this mission of, the space I work in. So I very much see myself focusing on that until the mission is done. And by that, I mean, it's sort of past all of these, kind of growing pains.
People often say, $4.5 billion, it's too big a fund for the space. Where's he going to deploy that?
When we announced it, there were two funds. There was a venture fund and a seed fund. And part of our charter is we can invest in over-the-counter assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum. The market cap of all the crypto assets today is something like $2.5 trillion. So it's if you just do the math, having a fund of that size is a very small percentage of the market.
Chris, listen, I've wanted to do this for a long time. I so appreciate you putting up with my flexible questions. You've been fantastic.
No, great.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah, really appreciate it.